Welcome back to Chapter 2. This is Part 3. We are on slide 44. And if you look at this slide, you'll see at the top there are three categories. One is classification, one is definition, and one is examples. And there are several classifications for individuals or students that have disabilities. I've just selected 4 on the left-hand side. If you take a look at the first one, intellectually disabled, this is usually students that have an IQ, fairly low IQ of perhaps 70 or below. To give you an example, let's say a Down syndrome student who might be attending school could have an IQ in the range of 50 to 70, and we would classify that student. In the past, that student was classified as mentally retarded, but they have changed that label now, and we call such students, or the classification for such students is intellectually disabled. The second category, learning disabilities. This category represents the most number of students that have disabilities. Students with learning disabilities have normal or average intelligence. Let's say they might have an IQ of 100, yet they have difficulties academically. For example, in the area of reading, we might have a 5th grade student who has a fairly normal or average intelligence of an IQ, let's say, of 100, but yet might be reading at a 3rd grade level. So there's a gap between their intelligence and their actual performance. And we call that classification a learning disabilities classification. The third category is behavior disturbed or disoriented or emotionally disturbed, emotionally handicapped. These students that have a classification such as this might have internalized or externalized behaviors. In other words, internalized behavior, a student that has emotional problems may be very quiet, may be very withdrawn. Externalized might be a student who is very aggressive, who lashes out, and this is the third classification of disabilities. The fourth classification is gifted. It's not necessarily a disability, but oftentimes the gifted classification is included in the disability category because they receive federal funding. These are students at the upper end of the ability continuum and also require special services. Gifted students also may have a learning disability and or may have emotional problems as well. So I'm hoping this chart will be of benefit to you. Look at the classifications, make sure you're aware of the definitions, and then also you can click on examples from YouTube there to better illustrate what those classifications are. On slide 45, usually when we're looking at students in public schools, we look at what we call a spectrum of services. Schools and school districts provide a number of services to students with disabilities, but how does that look like organizationally? Well, if we look at slide 46, you can see the spectrum of service that is generally available in most school districts. And if we start at the left-hand side, we are looking at services that are least intensive or require least expertise. So if we look at left-hand side, we have basically general education. And a student might be in a regular classroom, let's say a student that has learning disabilities and is served mostly by the general education teacher. In the second category, or the second box there as we move to the right of the continuum, you'll see a general ed with consultation or co-teaching. So we may have a student, let's say, that has learning disabilities or perhaps even emotional issues, and we have the education or the instruction being provided by the general education teacher and another individual. And this other individual usually is someone who's certified in special ed. They may be consulting with the classroom teacher, giving them direction, giving them some ideas on how to meet the needs of that particular student, or they may actually be working right alongside that general education teacher for a certain period of time during the day. The third classification is on our continuum is itinerant teacher. This is usually a teacher that has a degree or certification in learning disabilities. Also could be speech or language. It could also be occupational therapy or physical therapy, but an itinerant teacher usually travels around to the different schools and provides services. So they might be at school A Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for a half a day, and then school B Monday, Wednesday, Friday for the second half of the day. Usually districts that are smaller will have an itinerant teacher because there's not enough students in one school to actually be able to fund that teacher, so they'll take that teacher and move them around to different schools so they can meet the needs of students through moving to different classrooms and different schools. The resource teacher, the next category, is like an itinerant teacher, but a resource teacher actually stays in the school. And a resource teacher might go into a regular classroom and assist the teacher, but most likely the resource teacher has their own separate room. Students are pulled out, students with disabilities are pulled out of the regular classroom, let's say perhaps for an hour a day, and the resource teacher will see these students generally in small groups, usually 3 to 5 in a group. And again, a student that has learning disabilities may receive most of their instruction in a regular classroom, but might be pulled out one time each day for a period of perhaps 30 minutes or an hour to receive services from the resource teacher. The resource teacher and the classroom teacher have to work side by side, or have to cooperate with each other because the resource teacher needs to know what's going on in the regular ed classroom, and the regular ed teacher needs to know what the resource teacher is working with his or her particular student. Now, as we move to the far right of the continuum, a self-contained teacher or self-contained classroom is generally in the regular school, but it's students that have severe problems. It could be academic, or it could be emotional problems, or it could be a student that is intellectually disabled. And usually a self-contained classroom is has a small number of students. Perhaps they might have 10 students. They'll have generally will have an aide working with that teacher. Again, these students will have more severe disabilities and need that constant focus and attention. Depending on the student may be included or integrated into some special activities such as music, art, PE, those types of things. And as we move to the far right, we have specialized services. A student might be going to a special day school, and again, generally these are students that have severe needs or needs that cannot be met in a regular school. They could be homebound or hospital bound if they have a physical disability, or if they've been in an accident and they can't receive services in the regular school. Then that classification could be homebound. Or it could be residential school. Students that have emotional problems, perhaps they have a drug problem, drug issue, might actually be staying overnight for an extended period of time in a residential school. So this is the continuum of services that are provided for students that have disabilities of all types. And again, we go from left-hand side to least severe to most severe, and requiring the most assistance on the right-hand side. Slide 47, enrichment and acceleration. We're going to talk a little bit about gifted, our two strategies that we use for gifted students. And gifted students are generally considered part of special education because of their special and unique needs. And now if we look at the above slide, you can note the difference between acceleration and enrichment, and it'll be important for you to recognize those differences. usually a gifted teacher. Usually there's one per school. However, a gifted teacher could be itinerant. Oftentimes those students are pulled out from the regular classroom for perhaps a day and work with those students one time per week. But there are many different ways in which the needs of gifted can be met in a school. Slide 49, this slide represents what teachers can do to adapt instruction for the students with special needs. See if you can go ahead and fill in the blank, and then see the next slide are the key points on page 54 for the answers. You can see on slide 50 the answers are in yellow. The fifth topic that we're dealing with is at-risk students, and these students are students who have similar needs as students with disabilities, but for whatever reason they do not qualify for special ed services. In order to qualify for special ed services, you have to be tested, you have to meet certain criteria, and there are some students who do not meet that criteria. They still have needs in the perhaps in the emotional or academic area, but for whatever reason, they're not entitled to services that students with disabilities receive. Not every student who has difficulty is a special ed student on slide 52. Some do not qualify for special ed, as I mentioned, but are considered at risk. At-risk students can often benefit from the same type of support and services as those with learning disabilities. So the question you might ask is why aren't those students being served? Well, oftentimes they are, but through other types of resources. For example, an at-risk student can receive assistance through what we would call Title I or Title I funding. These are special teachers. Usually they have a reading background, and they can work with at-risk students. But students with learning disabilities generally are funded through the federal government. That money is filtered down to the state, and again, in order to receive special ed services, you have to qualify for special ed, and if you don't qualify, then that funding is not available there for students that are at risk that do not qualify for special education. Slide 54. These represent some of the many at-risk factors that are facing students today. So take a look at the left-hand side, read those factors, and read the descriptions on the right-hand side. Slide 55. Do you have a story of a student who was at risk but has become successful? Perhaps going through school, you've met somebody that had difficulty in a variety of areas. It could be academically, it could be home life, but they turned out okay. They turned out to be successful. If you do, post that as response 6 on Moodle. If you don't, perhaps talk about an at-risk student that you knew and during school, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of the factors, some of the challenges facing that particular student. Slide 56, these represent on the left-hand side the strategies for working with at-risk students. The question that I'd like to pose to you is, could these strategies be used for all students? And hopefully by now you're getting the idea that often the strategies that are used for students with learning disabilities or students that are at risk are good practices that can be used for all students. The final topic deals with learning styles. On slide 57. If we go to slide 58, what is your preferred way of learning? Do you like to hear instruction? Do you like the teacher to use visuals? Or do you like group work in which or hands-on type of learning? So those are 3 types of learning styles that we generally talk about. On slide 59, how do you learn? modalities that we just talked about, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. What kind of structure and support do you like? Do you like high structure, step-by-step directions by the teacher, or are you what we would call an independent learner? Do you like learning individually or as a group? How about motivation? Are you internally or externally motivated? And how about environment? Do light, temperature, noise, time of day, do they influence your learning? On slide 60 is an important term called metacognition, students' awareness of the ways they learn and their ability to control these factors. Metacognition is the ability to reflect, to be able to think about your own thinking. And I guess the question is, are you thinking happy thoughts now that you're almost to the end of this chapter, and actually almost to the end of this course? So the idea of metacognition is to be able to think about your thinking. As you are reading, and let's say that you are reading and you don't understand a certain a particular passage, do you utilize metacognition? Do you go back and say, you know what, I don't really understand this, I need to go back and reread it so that I do? Often students with disabilities do not have metacognition. They do not recognize that. And there are some other categories. For example, a student that has ADHD may not have the metacognition ability to be able to think about their own thinking. Often we take it for granted. So that's an important term for you to be aware of. Slide 61, last slide, is our self-assessment check for Chapter 2. Can be found on Moodle, and after you have taken that assessment, then you'll be ready for the Chapter 2 test. And we have completed Chapter 2.